Um, Thank you for joining us all today. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes as we wait for more people to join. So just sit tight. A couple of minutes and we'll get underway. For anyone just joining, we're just waiting another minute, I think, before we'll kick off the discussion. Just waiting for a few more people to join. Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. A very warm welcome to you, our participants, as well as our panelists and speakers to today's event entitled What's Next for Arms Trade Transparency, which is kindly organized by the Stimson Center. My name is Matthew Stedman, and I'm a researcher at the ATT Monitor at Control Arms. I'm delighted to be moderating today's panel, which features some highly distinguished speakers who I will introduce shortly. Before we start, however, I'm sure you're all expecting this, a few housekeeping rules. I want to remind you that today's session is being recorded and that it will later be made available on the Stimson Center website. I also encourage you to leave your questions for our panelists in the Q&A function of the webinar. And if possible, indicate to whom you're addressing your question. This will really help me to direct the right person to ask the question to. Feel free to send in your questions at any point, and we'll address them once all three panelists have delivered their presentations. Now, by way of introduction, since the 1990s, a number of regional and international frameworks have been established to help better regulate the international trade in weapons and further transparency in the arms trade. Amongst these, the Arms Trade Treaty and the United Nations Register of Conventional Arms, or UNROCA, are two of the main ones. The Arms Trade Treaty, or ATT, is the first legally binding treaty to regulate the international trade in conventional arms. Its main object is to establish the highest possible common international standards for regulating the international trade in conventional arms and to prevent and eradicate the illicit trade and diversion of weapons. A core purpose of the ATT is to reduce human suffering and promote transparency and responsibility in the global arms trade. Similarly, the UNROCA, which was established in 1993, is the registry to which UN member states are called upon to provide information on their exports and imports of major conventional arms on an annual basis, with the aim of preventing excessive and destabilizing accumulation of weapons in order to help strengthen international peace and security. Now, one of the main mechanisms through which the ATT and the UN Register on Conventional Arms transparency objectives are realized is through reporting. Under the ATT, states parties are required to report on the measures they have taken to implement the treaty and to report annually on their exports and imports of conventional weapons, as UN member states are also required to do to UNROCA. However, despite this reporting providing some valuable insights into arms trade dynamics, transparency remains an elusive objective. Today, we'll be hearing from three experts on why that is, what the pressing challenges to transparency are in the context of these instruments, and what more can be done to help strengthen transparency in the global arms trade. Before that, however, I'm delighted to introduce His Excellency Robert Indenbos, the permanent representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the Conference on Disarmament and Ambassador at Large, who will provide some opening remarks to kick off the conversation. So without further ado, Ambassador, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And as the Netherlands representative to the Conference on Disarmament, I have the honor to kick off this event and welcome you all. And I will speak a few words of short introduction. I would like to thank the Stimson Center for inviting us to partake in today's side event to the meeting of the first committee, where we will be reflecting on the progress made to advance arms trade transparency during this year's 8th Conference of States Parties to the ATT, and also look ahead, as the title of this event highlights, at what is next for arms trade transparency. And in a sense, the timing for this event couldn't be better, as we inch closer and closer to nearly 10 years since the adoption of the ATT. Since its inception, the Netherlands has been proud supporter of this important treaty that has put in place milestone global regulations for the international trade of conventional weapons. We, of course, also greatly appreciate the ATT Monitor, and we are pleased that the analysis of the ATT Monitor are increasingly feeding into the substantive work of the treaty. For example, via the Working Group on Transparency and Reporting, which the Netherlands has previously co-chaired. For us, the Netherlands, the ATT Monitor plays an important role in looking ahead at what is next for the treaty and applying the lessons learned from the past. Historically, the ATT Monitor has focused on the field of transparency and reporting and has helped us to identify gaps and best practices in the implementation of our reporting obligations. This year, the ATT Monitor has chosen a more broad perspective by also exploring the challenges regarding universalization through case studies. This is a welcome addition and reminds us of the joint work that is still to be done to convince all UN member states of the value of joining the ATT family. To that end, we are encouraged by new states joining this important treaty, such as the Philippines and Gabon. The ATT Monitor reminds us that implementation and universalization is not just about quantity, but also about quality. It's not just about the number of states parties, but also about their engagement and commitment to truly and effectively implement the treaty's obligations. It's also not just about the number of reports submitted, but the level of real transparency that is provided through the reports by way of accessible and detailed information. For the Netherlands, we historically strive to be as transparent as possible. For example, we publish up-to-date overviews every 2 months that show which authorizations were granted and which were denied, including information on the type of goods, destination country, and the reason for denial. However, the year 2022 is challenging in terms of reporting and transparency. And due to my country's decision to supply arms to Ukraine, in order to help Ukraine exercise its right to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, we have had to limit our transparency for operational reasons and on the basis of national security. And this was not a comfortable decision, but a necessary one, nevertheless. And we are hopeful to return to a policy of full transparency as soon as possible. And we are interested to hear from the experts who are joining today how this and other trends are shaping the current arms transparency environment now and going forward. What are these trends and how can we best continue to secure transparency in the ATT context, especially under the current difficult and challenging circumstances which we found ourselves in after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? What progress was made at the CSP8? What are the steps that governments, but also civil society and other stakeholders can take to further enhance public understanding? We count on Stimson, the ATT Monitor, and other civil society actors, such as Control Arms, to continue to provide us with recommendations and guidance on how to best secure transparency in the ATT context. We look forward to hearing the thoughts of the stakeholders present today on this. Thank you very much. And before I hand back over to you, moderator, I would like to wish you participants a fruitful event. I myself, I unfortunately have to leave a little bit earlier because we are getting some instructions with regard to the voting next week, and we have to be all well educated for that. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. We really appreciate you coming and making time in your schedule to be here. I know how much it's been changing this week. So thank you so much for delivering those remarks. and for laying out some of the key questions that we're going to focus on today, which I think will really help guide our discussions. And those questions you posed at the end of your remarks actually lead me on very nicely to introducing the three people whose job is going to be to try and provide some answers to them, and shed some light more generally on these topics. So I'll move on to introducing our distinguished panel of speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. So first, we will hear from Karina Solmirano, who is the ATT Monitor Project Lead at Control Arms. She will be sharing some of the findings from this year's edition of the ATT Monitor Report, which assesses states parties' compliance with their reporting obligations based on 2020 annual reports. Second, we will hear from Rachel Stoll, who is the Vice President of Research Programs and Director of the Conventional Defense Program at the Stimson Center. She will be discussing findings from two recently launched Stimson publications that look at transparency issues in the context of ATT reporting and the opportunities there are to enhance said reporting. And finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Paul Holtom, who is the head of the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program at UNADIR, and he will be discussing the decline in UN-ROCA reporting, its implications for arms trade transparency, and what can be done to arrest this decline. Now, each speaker will have about 10 minutes for their presentation. I'm conscious that we only have an hour together here today, so speakers, I ask you to please respect the time. I'll come down very hard on you if not. And once all three of them have delivered their presentations, we're going to open the floor for a Q&A session. So feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A function while they speak or afterwards as well. And with that, I would like to turn to our first speaker, Karina. Karina, please, you have the floor.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador Indenbos, for your remarks. And it's a pleasure for me to be here with my friends Rachel and Paul and discussing, these topics that gathers us together. For those of you who don't know, the ATT Monitor, who is an independent project of Control Arms, is the de facto international monitoring mechanism of the Arms Trade Treaty, and it serves as a source of information on the implementation of and compliance with the treaty. Our research and analysis serves to strengthen the treaty implementation and improve the transparency in the conventional arms trade. So my job today, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. My job today is to present, like Matthew said, some of the key findings of our ATT Monitor 2022 report that was launched in August just recently. But I'm going to focus basically on the analysis of our chapter 2, which is the analysis of annual reports of 2020. And I want to encourage you, nevertheless, to take a look at the full report, as it covers a broad range of topics. And as Ambassador Indenbos just said, we had a great chapter and a long chapter this year on universalization and efforts to extend the treaty to other countries. So take a look. I think Ryan is offering you the link there for those who haven't downloaded it yet. So starting on the next one. So for those of you who were in person at CSP 8, this presentation will definitely look familiar and perhaps repetitive. But I still hope that today, after the event, we can walk away with some food for thought when it comes to transparency in the arms trade. So let me start briefly with the methodology that we use in our chapter 2 this year, which was developed last year as well. So in chapter 2, we analyze transparency in terms of 3 reporting categories. The first one that you see there is that we look at annual reports in terms of how fully they comply with Article 13.3 reporting obligations. We then look at annual reports and if they contribute to the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty, and as such, if they are meaningfully transparent. And finally, we look at reports that contribute to an even higher standard of transparency by including additional information. So I will describe each category in the next slides. So next, thank you. So starting with the first one, so the ATT monitor considers a report to be fully compliant with Article 13.3 if it's submitted to the ATT Secretariat within 1 week of the 31st May deadline, and if it includes both exports and imports and/or relevant NIL reports. The submission of annual reports for 2020 continued a long-term trend of decreasing transparency. As you can see here, the percentage of the states parties that submitted 2020 annual reports was the lowest it has been since the beginning of submissions of ATT annual reports to the ATT Secretariat. Only 57% submitted annual reports compared to 82% that did it in 2015. In parallel to this decrease in reporting compliance, confidential reporting continued to increase. In 2020, 30% of these reports were confidential compared to 21% in 2019 and 4% in 2015. And Rachel will update this information later on. But what these two combined trends cause for the arms trade is that they severely restrict the availability of information on arms transfers, and it doesn't allow us to know more about international arms transfers, flows, and trends. So in the next one, you can see these trends, as I mentioned before. This underscores the year-on-year decrease in the percentage of reports due that are submitted. Moving to the next one, the second category of analysis is those reports that fulfill the transparency aims and objectives of the treaty. The criteria we use to determine this is whether reports, for instance, are made publicly available at the ATT Secretariat, if they disaggregate data, if they indicate, for instance, the nature of the reported transfers, or if they provide numbers or units and financial values of these transfers. Those are some of the examples, and you can take a look at them in our full report. In 2020, only 70% of due reports were meaningfully transparent according to this criteria. And to give you some context, this figure was 46% in 2015. But when we look at publicly available reports, the percentage of these that are meaningfully transparent have remained relatively consistent over time, indicating also that the reporting capacity among states might have also remained static. However, on a much more positive note, the decline in meaningfully transparent reports has been accompanied by a decrease in data aggregation. As you can see, the percentage of states parties who fully disaggregate all data has actually increased since 2015, meaning that some states parties have addressed data aggregation practices identified in previous reports. And in doing so, we have really strengthened the quality of the reporting of these states. I really want to emphasize the importance of this finding and how encouraging it is that more states over time are providing more disaggregated data. So just to underline some of the points I made, the figure in the next slide shows these numbers that I have mentioned and the percentage of reports due that are meaningfully transparent. Moving on to the next one. One specific point that I want to make here is that one of the most significant ways in which publicly available reports do not meet the minimum standard of transparency is, like I said before, through data aggregation. When information is aggregated excessively, it becomes impossible to know what weapons were transferred to whom, and it also prevents to determine whether states parties are actually fulfilling the treaty commitments. Excessive aggregation was identified in 9 publicly available 2020 annual reports. This number is lower than the previous year when excessive aggregation was present in 13 reports. But when we dig a little bit deeper and we take a look, at the information in the weapons categories of these reports, transfers involving small arms and light weapons continue to be the most susceptible to aggregation. In 2020, every single transfer where our research detected aggregation involved this type of weapons. And you see there the percentage, 46.8% of aggregated transfers were found in this category. And moreover, digging a little bit deeper, when we look at the subcategories of weapons, of small arms especially, we see that the more prone to aggregation are revolvers, self-loading pistols, rifles and carbines, etc. So moving on to the next one, the third category and final category of this specific analysis that we do is to look at those reports and examine those reports that contribute to a higher standard of transparency. What we find is in these reports, or what we look at, is if they include, for instance, descriptions and comments of the transfers, if they, for instance, indicate if commercially sensitive or national security information was or was not withheld, and where in the report was withheld, or if they include, for instance, voluntary national categories or national definitions of conventional arms. So we found that there is a group of states parties, that is the one that consistently submits public reports, that they do tend also to include comments describing the nature of reported transfers, as well as descriptions of those transfers. So in 2020, 60% of the states parties included descriptions for some or all of the reported transfers, and 57 included comments for some or all of the transfers. In addition to that, 11 states parties including data on arms that are covered within the scope of Article 3, but that are not explicitly specified in the reporting template. And this includes, for instance, shotguns or grenade launchers. So again, this is a clear example of a state going above and beyond to the threshold of what is required by the ATT. Next one, please. Thank you. But no state, no, the one before, no state party actually reports all the information that we would like to see. And we hope that in the future this can, improve. So based on that, based on the fact that not all the states provide every single of these different points that we include in our categories, we found that overall in 2020, 16 states parties did fulfill the three criteria. They comply with Article 13.3 reporting obligations. They provided information that goes beyond what is required by the ATT and contribute in that sense to meaningfully transparency. And they also went beyond and supported a higher standard of transparency. Of these, however, only 3 states parties provided the most information that supported a higher standard of transparency. They, for instance, fully disaggregated the data for each transfer by weapon type, by importer and or exporter. They provided the number of units and financial value. They indicated whether it was actual or authorized transfers. So bravo for these examples. There are few examples, but we have them. So in this one, for instance, this is one of the examples of the type of reports that in our analysis, contributes to a higher standard of transparency. You can see here that it provides very detailed information of each transfer. It includes comments and descriptions of each of them. It indicates, for instance, the number of units transferred. It indicates also whether they are authorized or actual, etc. So these are the type of good practice and examples that we would like to see more often. So moving on to the next and final slide, the last part of our analysis, and it's the largest actually in our annual report, has to do with country profiles. The basis of the analysis for our country profiles is publicly available reports submitted to the ATT Secretariat until 1st of February, which is our cutoff date for analysis. So any report that was submitted after 1st of February, and we know for sure that there were a few more that were submitted, were not considered in this analysis. They will be considered probably in next year's monitor report. So we only analyzed these 42 state parties. And in this section of the annual report, what you can see is that each of these country profiles provide data on key reporting practice metrics, a summary of areas of good practice, areas for improvement. The profiles also contain a summary of the transfers reported by each state party, which includes basic comparable information such as import and export partners, and overall numbers of weapons by categories and subcategories. And as of last year, we have also started to include information on reports submitted and made publicly or confidential for the past 5 years. And so, for instance, last year we covered 2015 to 2019, and this year we covered 2015 to 2020, included in that lower box in the picture. So the idea here is to give a better, more useful overview of reporting practice over the long term, rather than just a snapshot of that specific year. That allows us to track how transparent or how transparent states have been over time just by looking to this a specific box. So I would really like to invite you to take a look at the country profiles. They are enormous. There's a lot of information. We have just uploaded them also in Spanish and in French, so you can check that out also on our website. You don't have excuses. If you don't speak English or you don't understand English, you can do it in other languages as well. And with this, I conclude. And I thank you very much for your attention and remain open to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina. Well, I mean, full disclosure, I worked on this report with Karina, but yet it still amazes me just how much data we can garner from these reports. And also how interesting the trends are that arise from the data. So, the drop in overall reporting, the rise in private reporting, the decrease in data aggregation, and kind of how these trends all relate to each other and how they've evolved over a longer period of time is so interesting. And this also leads me nicely onto our next speaker, Rachel Stoll, who's going to be talking about the findings from the two most recent Stimson Center publications that focus on 2021 ATT annual reports. So without further ado, Rachel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to you and Karina and Paul, and of course, Ambassador Indenbos, and now his colleague, Abel Hartman from the Kingdom of the Netherlands for participating in this event today. Today, as you said, Matt, I really want to provide an overview of some of the key transparency issues that we've identified in our years of work around ATT reporting and the challenges and opportunities that exist to enhance reporting under the treaty. In full disclosure, this work was generously supported by the governments of the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland. So we are incredibly grateful for their support. My remarks today are drawing from Stimson's two latest analyses of ATT reporting. The first, which we launched at CSP 8 in August, taking stock of ATT reporting, and the one we are privileged to launch today, mixed reviews, positive developments, and negative trends in the 2021 ATT annual reports. And these reports really look at the trends, the gaps, the challenges, the good practices, the lessons learned from the first 7 years of ATT reporting, as well as looking at a more in-depth look at this year's annual reports, which were submitted in calendar year 2022, but actually cover the transfers from 2021. So if you take these reports sort of together, they paint really, I think, a holistic picture of both past and present reporting trends and challenges, and really give us some guidance of how we can strengthen reporting in the future. So both of these reports really closely examine what we consider to be the three main transparency challenges that have emerged over the first 7 years of ATT reporting, particularly with annual reports. First, we've seen worrying declines in reporting compliance. Second, we've seen an increase in private reporting. And third, we have inconsistent and sometimes contradictory information. So Karina mentioned some of these challenges as well, but I'd like to unpack them in the sense of the analysis that we have done. So if we look at compliance issues, which I think is the biggest challenge that we have, if people don't submit their reports, it's impossible to collect data and do analyses of those reports, is really what we're seeing in the last 7 years. 110 states parties have been required to submit at least one annual report. The two newest states parties, the Philippines and Gabon, have yet to have a report due, but only 74% of states parties that have been due to submit a report have ever done so. And when we look at compliance over time, we can see that compliance rates have declined nearly every year since reporting began, and the most recent reporting period is really no exception. What's really troubling is this year we had 5 new states parties that were required to submit an annual report for the first time this year, and only one of them actually did so. So that's a compliance rate of 20% of those new states parties, and that is problematic. That's not a great start, and we have to do better. Of course, we know that this year's compliance rate is subject to change. The year is not over. We know that reports often come in way after the deadline. I think what's a little bit encouraging is the percentage of reports that we have now. 58% is actually a little bit of an increase of the 56% of reports that we received last year at this time, so this time in October. So perhaps that's a positive sign, maybe too early to tell, but even a small increase is welcome. I think what we're seeing is a little bit troubling, particularly with all of the work that has been done in the last 7 years to identify and assist states parties in overcoming any reporting challenges. I want to just share a little bit about what we know about the non-reporters. We found that states parties that have yet to submit any of their required annual reports are overwhelmingly those that face development challenges, with small island developing states and least developed countries representing a majority of non-reporters, and this has been true over time. So of the 46 states parties with overdue 2021 reports, for example, over 82% of those are among the world's least developed countries or small island developing states, or both. So this is really, I think, significant because it underscores the importance of investigating and addressing the resource-related challenges that many states parties face. We do have some reasons to be hopeful. That's why our report is called Mixed Reviews. Over the past year, we have 5 states parties that submitted their annual reports for the first time after years of not fulfilling their annual reporting requirements. And many of those were not just submitting one-year reports, but multiple year reports. On top of those 5, we have 27 additional states parties that went back and submitted reports that were due in previous years. So I think this is a really good example of great, not even just good practice, great practice, that it's never too late to submit reports. And even if it's years overdue, we welcome those reports. The second trend that we continue to see is the rise in private reporting, a practice in which states parties choose to only make their reports available to other states parties and the ATT Secretariat. And the submission of these private reports presents several challenges. It certainly complicates efforts to analyze weapons flows and identify problematic transfers or potentially destabilizing weapons accumulations, but it also prevents accurate assessments of whether states are complying with the ATT's provision. More fundamentally, I think as well, private reporting makes it difficult for us to evaluate whether the treaty is living up to its object and purpose by contributing to a reduction in human suffering, strengthening peace and security and stability, promoting cooperation, transparency, and responsible action, and building global confidence. And we've seen significant increases in private reporting over the years. When you look at year one, just 4% of the 2015 annual reports were private. And that's compared to where we are now, which is 33% of those submitted in 2020 for the 2021 period. 3 of the 21 states parties that submitted private 2021 annual reports were ones that until now had exclusively submitted public reports. So for each of the past 6 years. So that is a troubling trend as well, that formerly public reporters are switching to private reporting. There are some positive steps, though, towards public reporting. 4 states parties submitted public reports in 2021 after more than one or more year of private reporting. So hopefully they have shifted now from previously submitting private reports to submitting public reports. Another state party whose report was inadvertently made private noted the mistake, promptly addressed it, and made their report public. In the course of our research, several states parties have described reporting privately by mistake, including one that didn't even know their report was private until we pointed it out to them. So this willingness to sort of switch when a mistake is made is very, very welcome. And then lastly, we're finding that states have the information that states often provide persistent transparency challenges. And Karina delineated some of these that she has seen over the past 7 years. And that includes things like information being withheld or otherwise admitted, lacking sufficient detail, or aggregated in very problematic ways. And I think what we've seen is in the past year, these practices have continued where we see states not indicating whether they're reporting on authorized or actual transfers, or providing the information on the importing or exporting state. And so sometimes we have limited analytical value in the submissions. Sometimes we see some aggregated data that makes it difficult to get a complete picture of the arms trade. So listing multiple importing states or states of origin, or not indicating the quantity transferred or what originates from each state, et cetera. So we want to encourage states to be as transparent, as complete, and as clear as possible. Again, but there are some positive trends that we saw this year as well. Some states provided comments or descriptions on their reported transfers, and that gives us those valuable insights into the items transferred, such as the weapon type, the manufacturer, the caliber, or the circumstances of the transfer itself, including information on the corresponding transfer license, the actors involved in the transfer date, the authorized end use, for example. We do know that the ATT permits states parties to withhold commercially sensitive and national security related information. And some states have indicated now the type of information that they're withholding, including sometimes we withhold the number or the value of what was transferred. And that request that was given to states parties that they consider providing more information on the information they withheld now appears in the revised annual reporting template that was endorsed by CSP7 in 2021. And this may actually prompt state parties to include more helpful details. Now we know there's always room for improvement in ATT reporting. We can identify now reasons why states have struggled to provide comprehensive ATT reports. There are often significant challenges to reporting, and these vary from state to state. But in a survey that Stimson conducted in collaboration with SIPRI, nearly 2/3 of the responding states party described facing challenges in submitting their reports. And I've listed them here, but first we have a lack of awareness and understanding of our ATT obligations. Second is capacity challenge and resource challenges. Third are internal and bureaucratic challenges. And then fourth are political and security challenges. Knowing what these challenges are gives us an opportunity to look at a path forward and how we can begin to overcome those persistent challenges. And we know there's been significant progress over the past 7 years, but there is also more work to do. I don't have time today to really unpack what all of those recommendations might look like, but certainly we know that we can take advantage and leverage some reporting synergies between different instruments. And my colleague Paul Holdham is about to talk about the UN Register, which is a great example of those synergies. We can work with national governments to develop national measures to help facilitate reporting. There's plenty of implementation assistance that's available from civil society, the ATT Secretariat, the Voluntary Trust Fund, the European Union, the Working Group on Transparency and Reporting. There are many places to go to get help, and states shouldn't be afraid to ask for it. And certainly having more coordinated outreach with non-reporting states parties, identifying what their challenges are, working with them on an individual basis would be incredibly helpful. I will stop there and allow my colleague Paul to share some of those reporting synergies. But I think as we look at the 10th anniversary of the ATT's adoption coming up in 2023, we really have an opportune time to take stock of the progress made and the opportunities to continue to improve reporting moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Wow, so much in there again that I think is going to provide a lot of food for the discussion at the end. It was really interesting to see some of the positive developments over the previous year, because it's true we sometimes have a tendency to focus on the negative. And it's also really interesting to see how states are changing their reporting year on year. So some switching to private, others going public, which shows that this isn't a static issue. You know, it's evolving every year. Countries are changing their practice. So I think digging further into that, if we have time in the Q&A, could be really good. However, I think we've covered the ATT in quite a lot of depth so far. So we're going to switch gears now and turn our focus to a different instrument, the UN Register. And I don't think there's anyone better placed to walk us through the state of play and issues with UN ROCA reporting than Paul Holtom, who has worked extensively on these issues and is really intimately familiar with the nuances of the register. So with that, Paul, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you so much, Matthew, for the very generous introduction. It's a great privilege to share the screen with such a great panel on this important topic of what's next for arms trade transparency. It's my role, I think, to look backwards before looking forward in talking about the UN Register of Conventional Arms, or UNROCA, or the Register for short. But I do think, as Rachel mentioned, it provides some maybe useful lessons on challenges and opportunities for transparency in arms transfers more generally, and for the ATT and other instruments. I fully recognize that many of you have not tuned in for a history lesson, but forgive me for starting an intervention that talks about what happened 30 years ago, a time when I had a bit more hair on the top of my head. At the end of 1991, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the resolution Transparency in Armaments, which established the register. And since 1993, each year, we've had UN member states being called upon to provide information on exports and imports of major conventional arms to the register, as a means to help contribute towards preventing the excessive and destabilizing accumulation of arms in order to enhance confidence, promote stability, help states to exercise restraint, ease tensions, and strengthen regional and international peace and security. And although the instrument is 30 years old and was established at the end of the Cold War and just after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, it strikes me that it's an instrument where these objectives, I think, remain very useful and pertinent for our situation today. I think it's important also to note that the register was not supposed to be static. It was supposed to evolve, and that every 3 years, the UN Secretary General appoints a group of around 20 governmental experts to consider the relevance of the instrument and whether there are developments in technology or new security threats that mean that the scope, the arms covered by the register, need to be amended or changed. And the group is also intended to consider ways to achieve the goal of universal participation by all UN member states. So that's to say that it's hoped that all member states will submit information annually on their arms exports and imports. And the group looks at practical ways to help with this. Now, currently, there are 3 ways in which states can participate in the register, and not all of these options were available 30 years ago. So although as a consultant to the group of governmental experts, and it feels like change is glacial, change has happened over 30 years, and there are developments worth reporting on. First, a state can report on imports and exports of battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, artillery, combat aircraft and unmanned combat aerial vehicles, attack helicopters, warships, and missile launchers. And there's a description for each of these conventional arms to help with reporting, as well as a guidance booklet. So it helps you understand which missiles to report and which ones you don't need to. Since 2017, states have been encouraged to use a 7+1 formula for participating in the register. So this is the second option on the screen. And this means you don't report just on the 7 categories I've mentioned, but also on international transfers of small arms like weapons. So for those of you that are intimately familiar with the scope of the ATT, these are the 8 categories, but in the register parlance, it's 7+1. Each year, each of the groups of experts has discussed the proposal to create an 8th category for small arms like weapons, but instead we've had this rather creative solutions in the past few groups. Finally, the third category is a nil return for when a state has no imports or exports of items covered by the register to report. And this can be either of the 7 categories of major conventional weapons or the 7+1 formula. Now, for me, a key point here is that all of the information provided by member states to the Office for Disarmament Affairs is made publicly available in a report by the Secretary General and on the website unroca.org. So a slight difference there to the ATT approach. And also, in addition, states can provide additional information on conventional arms acquired from national producers in their territory, rather than just imports, as well as information on their holdings. And I think that this helps to give a full picture to inform discussions on destabilizing accumulations and challenges in this regard. And so it's particularly useful for achieving the objective I shared on the previous slide. So why was my title so downbeat? The register sounds great. Well, for its first 10 years, almost half of UN member states participated in the register regularly. And at the turn of the millennium, just as it was reaching its teens, we saw more than 120 states providing information on their arms transfers each year. Now, this is a growth spurt that I think made us think at the time that the norm of transparency in international arms transfers was well established and robust. But unfortunately, as this rather basic graph demonstrates, there's been a dramatic decline since the register hit its mid-teens. It went off the rails and has continued on a downward trajectory into its 20s. Expert groups have put forward various reasons for this decline, and many of them are familiar with the points that Rachel mentioned a moment ago. But in addition, there's questions around the engagement by the Secretariat of the register declining in terms of resources not being devoted at the same level as previously, more reporting requirements for states and an increasing burden. And in particularly, I think important is that there's nil returns representing more than 50% of submissions in the early 2000s, and now just around 10%, which for me signals that perhaps many states are getting fatigued and don't see the relevance in the instrument as it's currently constructed in the same way as they had earlier expectations on this. So we went from 124 submissions 20 years ago to just 37 by this summer. But before we turn off the live support on the register, I think it's useful to compare the submission rates of the ATT annual reports that are made public with those of the register submissions, which are all made public. And Karina and Rachel, I think, have done a tremendous job and in much more detail than me in terms of showing some of the concerns with this switch from public reporting to private reporting. And I think that what I feel here is that with this comparison on this slide, it looks like it's a broader problem in terms of public transparency on international arms transfers, not just a problem of the register or the ATT. And it seems quite strange when we can find a lot of information on international transfers of conventional arms on our phones by looking at the news or company press releases that we're seeing a tendency for fewer and fewer states to make this information publicly available via 2 well-established mechanisms. So will public transparency get worse? Well, I've already mentioned the concern of more reports for different instruments means that states with limited capacities are struggling to report, and here Rachel's mentioned this point too. There's also the fact that I think the nature of the international arms trade is characterized not just by the shipment of a complete tank or a combat aircraft or a warship, but co-production and licensed production arrangements between states, which means reporting on complete systems of weapons of war doesn't reflect the reality of the trade today, when there are lots more complex ways in which technologies, military capabilities are being transferred. And finally, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's the world's largest arms exporters that help to keep the register at the level it currently is and provide a lot of information on international arms transfers. A common estimate is that because of the high level of participation by what CIPRI calls sort of the largest exporters in the world, around 90% of the world's transfers of major conventional weapons should be captured by the register, even if 3/4 of UN member states don't report. But on this issue, and as mentioned at the outset by Ambassador in Den Bosch, there is the issue of whether the conflict in Ukraine will have an impact on public reporting by some of these large exporters and some of the states that have been amongst the most transparent over the past 30 years. So it's possible we will be seeing private reports for the ATT and potentially no submission for the register or aggregation or omission of certain data. So for me, this is something that potentially we need to be thinking about moving forward. But it's not all doom and gloom. Just as our previous speakers have spoken about the positive elements, I thought I should do the same. Because on a practical level, there's a lot being done that I think can help states put in place national systems for collecting and processing data to prepare and submit annual reports on their exports and imports to both the ATT and the register. There's guidance on what to do and also efforts to reduce the burden of reporting. And here the example of ATT states parties now being able to simply tick a box when sending in their ATT annual reports to say that they're happy for this information to also be provided to the UN for use in submitting a return for the register. To my knowledge, the Office for Disarmament Affairs has received 18 ATT annual reports in this way so far, with I believe another 5 to come. Somewhere between up to, I think, 10 or 11 of these states hadn't submitted to the register. So we're going to see an increase from that 37 that I mentioned earlier to a level where the UN register level of submissions this year will be higher than public reports for the ATT. And this is the first time since the first year of reporting to the ATT that this will happen. And to be honest, it's the assumption I think we should be seeing, given that the register has potentially all member states of the UN participating compared to just states parties to the ATT. So we could see the register sort of improving. And I think this is an important way of showing these linkages and the practical steps that can be taken. But there also needs to be political will to provide the necessary resources for reporting. And Rachel's conducted a lot of research on this issue of why states don't report. And we've recognized in the register context that a lot of discussions are focused around, my country doesn't import, export many major conventional arms. It's not the main threat to my security, where are the small arms and light weapons? And we've had some adjustments to reflect these concerns in the scope of the register, but I still don't think it's at a level where many states feel comfortable with the current situation. And that I think is going to be an impediment, but hopefully those changes can take place moving forward. And the fact that the register has this inbuilt 3-year review process for its scope means that we can also see developments in uncrewed systems in the air, land, and sea domains, and their implications for security being reflected in the scope of the register as well. At least with the expert group, the scope can be changed. And this year, the group recommended changes to the category of attack helicopters to include uncrewed versions. And finally, it's not always easy for researchers to find out about the information contained in the register if it's used in confidential bilateral and multilateral discussions relating to arms transfer policies and conflict prevention. But we know that this takes place and that there are benefits in this regard, and that these weapons are still used in conflicts around the world. And the benefits of collecting and providing such information for accountability and early warning are perhaps not always promoted highly enough, but that use, the purpose, I think, is something we should always come back to and not just lament the decline in the level of reporting or the quality of the data. And with that, I think my 10 minutes are up, Matthew, so I'll hand back to you so we can have some questions and some discussion. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that this can help to stimulate efforts to ensure that public transparency in arms transfers is enhanced and returns to the level that it did 20 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yeah, I think it's fascinating, but also, as you say, quite concerning to see the dramatic decline in UN OCRA reporting, which is so similar in many ways to the drop in ATT reporting, just over a much smaller time period. But also, as you say, to note that the what we can do is so similar. It's about capacity building, cooperation, assistance, and decreasing the reporting burden between the two instruments. So making sure that they align a bit more. Which again, we can maybe come back to in the Q&A. So a big thank you to all our panelists for their presentations, which I think have given us a lot of food for thought, and will hopefully provide the basis of a good discussion. I'd now like to open the floor to questions. I see that we've already got quite a few come in, so thank you to our participants, and I would encourage you once more to keep submitting them. I think first I will turn all the way back to Karina, back to the first speaker. And just to pick up on one of the things you spoke about, you said that there was an increase in private reporting submission rates that we've witnessed since 2015, with 2020 being the year of the highest number of private reports. And I was wondering if you could provide any insight on suggestions to decrease the rate of private reporting that's highlighted in the report.
Thank you, Matt. I think the increase is even higher after seeing Rachel's numbers. And I think Rachel mentioned something about one of the potential ways to address this, which is, further assistance, further cooperation, perhaps even, further synergies among the different actors involved in reporting to both instruments. In the case of the ATT and knowing a little bit as well from smaller countries with whom I have engaged bilaterally in the past, it seems to me that part of the privacy in reporting sometimes has to do with not understanding completely how much of the information needs to be included. Some of them also have mentioned in the past that, there are many information that is confidential, that they have still in place some secrecy laws within the military institutions, and so that it would be very difficult to share that information. And this specifically happens in certain contexts in the global South. So I think the challenge there, or the response there, is to outreach in a much more efficient way. Like Rachel said, some of the things that you have to do is to actually perhaps even walk them through what is it that the report needs. And the ATT, I think, and this is one of the things that I discussed with a colleague during CSP8, is that the ATT template allows to states to indicate whether they are withholding information. We talk about this. So let's imagine that country needs to withhold, my point was, just indicate that you are withholding information, but still submit, the annual report and make it public, instead of fully private, which raises, questions about the intentions of the country, the dynamics of that country, and etc. So I think it's a little bit of the combination of doing that outreach, engaging bilaterally, but also understanding what the challenges of these particular states are, like Rachel mentioned before.
Thank you, Karina. Yeah, the point about the template and signaling where you're withholding information, for example, if there is information that's too sensitive to include, is much better than just simply restricting access to the report. So that's a really good point. Rachel, could I turn to you now? We've spoken a little bit about, with Karina, about the capacity building and assistance. And you mentioned in your presentation that your research suggests that coordination and information sharing is one of the most common challenges that states parties face in preparing their annual reports. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by this, and maybe discuss some of the ways that states can address these difficulties?
Sure, of course. I think, and if I could just add one thing to what Karina mentioned, I think there is a little on private reporting. I think there's a little bit of confusion about what private reporting means, and for states who are ticking that box that their reports are private, because we've actually seen states provide private reports to the ATT, but public reports to the UN Register. And often those reports are very, very similar in their content. And so getting to sort of the root of why states are choosing to make their reports private may actually help identify ways to improve transparency across all of the different instruments. On capacity building, I think there's a lot of internal bureaucratic challenges for states, including not having appointed a national point of contact or developed the processes to compile the data, or to even have a system where there are discussions about the data, developing a calendar for the various report submissions that are due. Sometimes the data is kept by multiple different agencies. And so coming up with a streamlined process and a regularized process for compiling and collecting that information, and having a focal point that's responsible for putting it into the format and getting the sign off from whoever is necessary, and then actually pressing that button and submitting the report. It seems very obvious, but for some states that have no experience in that practice, it can be very challenging. So sometimes what we like to do is to sit down with states and map out where is the data, who has access to it, who should be involved in the report compilation, who has the ultimate authority to submit that report, and develop sort of a site map of that process to make things easier for states.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, the point about civil society assistance is really valid. And it's actually something I also picked up in your presentation, and I was going to ask to all of the panelists whether your organizations that you're representing today have provided assistance on national reporting, and especially with regards to the taking advantage of the synergies between ATT, UN ROCA, and the UN Programme of Action reporting. So Karina and Paul, I don't know if you want to come in on that, because Rachel's already kind of answered it.
I leave that to Paul, and maybe I intervene later.
Thank you, Matthew. I mean, UNIDIR, I think, worked with Rachel several years ago before I joined in terms of guidance that looked at, complementarity, synergies between, for example, the Program of Action reports and the ATT initial report, as well as on the ATT annual reports and the UN register. So UNIDIR has provided that sort of general guidance, I think, in the past. In my previous lives in different organizations, I have worked with states, both at the national and also in regional settings, to try and help build capacity and awareness with regards to reporting to the register and the ATT, and also with a focus on small island developing states that Rachel's noted, where we tried to bring together countries from the Pacific and the Caribbean, where there were extremely common challenges, and I think some useful exchanges of practice that have helped with regards to their thinking about how to move forward. Despite being on opposite ends of the world, I think it was quite striking to see the commonalities that were there with these countries. And so for me, one can do work not just at the national level, but also I think at the regional level that can be beneficial. And whether that's with UNIDIR or other organizations on here, I think there's some great opportunities in that space.
Can I just add, Matt, that I think that COVID really stalled momentum on some of these issues, that Paul and I would travel around the world together to undertake these meetings in person, because it was very much meeting with people and really understanding their process and helping them develop a system. And you can do that over Zoom, and you can do that with guidance notes and FAQs, but it is really challenging. And so I'm hoping that as we hopefully return back to a world where we can travel more easily and more quickly, that we'll be able to undertake those kinds of training sessions. Again, both as Paul said, at the national level, sometimes we've done them at the sub-regional level, as well as the regional and cross-cutting regional workshops. I think it's really beneficial for states to learn from others, from their peers, understand the processes, how they've overcome that. And we've seen this desire through the ATT process for some peer-to-peer work as well. And so I think there are great opportunities in the years ahead. And I'm hoping that, again, with this 10th anniversary of the ATT's adoption looming, it's sort of a nice reminder to go back to what was the intentions of the treaty. How can we best implement those provisions and support states in meeting those goals and objectives?
Thank you so much.
Short intervention, because we are a newer project compared to Rachel and Paul's work on this field. So we have probably engaged less in those aspects. But one thing that just came to my mind is that we with the ATT monitor, because we have done some follow-up on the type of research that we do. Sometimes we do find, and this is really interesting, that states, or at least some of the officials in charge of reporting this information, sometimes they are not aware, for instance, that in the context of the ATT, you can submit your UNROCA report and vice versa, right? And so I think this is one of the ways in which we are now trying to raise awareness with certain states that have manifested that sort of, doubt. I had a call recently with colleagues in the Global South, which they basically openly suggested or asked, what type of, synergies, can be built between these instruments. So I redirected them to both UNIDIR and a Stimson Center, reports, but I also explained to them that this is a situation where, you can submit one report to one of the instruments and vice versa. And we have seen that. We have seen that this also decreases, the famous burden, in reporting that many states feel. So that's something that I think that's another key message that needs to be perhaps, pushed forward with the states, that, you can use the treaty and UNROCA allows for this sort of, interactions to happen between reporting.
Thank you, Karina. And yes, as Paul mentioned, hopefully that's going to increase in the years to come. I'm conscious of the time and I don't want to hold people back for too long. Thank you for staying on with us a little bit past the end time. I have one final question that I'd like to ask all three panelists. And if I could ask you to be as brief and concise as possible, I think we'd all appreciate it. So Ambassador Yoon of the Republic of Korea is now the president of ATT CSP9. What would be the advice of the panelists to Ambassador Yoon to encourage more states parties to submit reports and to do so publicly? So if you had a sit-down meeting with the ambassador today, what would be your advice or your input to him to further public reporting? So maybe we can go Karina, Rachel, and then finish off with Paul. Go in the order of the speakers. So yeah, Karina, please.
That's a very good question and a difficult one to answer, I guess, or to have, a concrete answer. I think, look, the way I see it is, I think, the work that the Conference of States Parties and, the ATT Secretary has been doing, over the last years to promote, further transparency has been good. It needs to be pushed. It needs to be, perhaps conducted even at a more higher level, diplomatically speaking, engaging more, not only the delegations in Geneva, but perhaps also the capitals, because that's where the information is. That's where it starts, the collection of the information, the submission of the report. So I would say I would reach the capitals more often than not.
So thanks, Matt. I think reporting has to be a priority. It is the most fundamental measure that we have to identify whether the treaty is being implemented, right? It's a very simple check. Are you meeting this obligation? This is not a voluntary exercise. This is a mandatory part of your ATT ratification or accession. And so I think that it's important that states realize that not only is it required, but that they don't have to go it alone. And there are tremendous resources, but there has to be a commitment at the highest levels to remind states of that obligation, to offer ways to help them fulfill that obligation. We know that what states are having challenges fulfilling those reporting obligations. And so let's take some coordinated outreach with those non-reporting states parties to identify, what are the particular barriers that they face to consistent and comprehensive reporting. And let's identify some tangible and targeted solutions to overcome them. And they may be sort of on a case-by-case basis. They may differ from country to country, but without sort of the reminders that this requirement, the deadline is looming, it's time to fulfill your obligation, how can we help, sort of that constant contact, I think it'll be very challenging to see reporting increase in the future.
So difficult to follow the previous two speakers, but I'll try and be brief with a couple of issues. I mean, for me, firstly, having the president send a letter to those that are not submitted to send a reminder to report, and if they have challenges to inform the Secretariat so that assistance can be provided, and restart the peer-to-peer mechanism that was sort of started before COVID as a way of helping with that. But also given that the issue for CSP9 will be responsible arms industry, and I saw Sabrina's question in the comments, one of the things we can look at is way in which other actors beyond civil society and states can help. And indeed, industry does have a role to play, I think, in terms of sharing information on licenses received and licenses used. And in some countries, there is legislation in place that obliges them to provide that information. So I think for me, having a contribution from industry in the working group on transparency and reporting on this particular issue could be quite helpful, in addition to all of the other things that we've become well established discussing in that forum. So just a couple of practical small steps, I think, rather than the bigger steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Rachel and Karina. I appreciate it was quite a tricky question to finish on, so thank you for thinking on your feet and giving a really, really good answers. With that, I hope the ambassador was watching, so he's got some input to go away with for CSP9. I'd like to thank all our participants who've attended today. I apologize again for running a little bit over, but I think it's testament to just how much there is to talk about on this issue. Stimson Center, the ATT Monitor, and UNIDIR will do more events like this in the future, so please stay tuned for any announcements on that part. I'd also like to thank the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the ambassador for providing the introductory remarks today that set the tone for the conversation. And please look for the recording of this session that's going to be made available by the Stimson Center in the coming weeks. So thanks again to everyone who's taken part, and have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are. Thank you.